Thanks everyone for sticking it out. Try to get through this pretty quick. It's just kind of a brief background to my research. As probably most of y'all know, the neotropics are an incredibly biodiverse region in the world. And in Costa Rica alone, which is a really tiny country, we have 894 bird species that have been recorded. However, very few of these bird species have actually been studied in any great detail. So we have this incredible amount of species, but no one's actually really looked a whole lot into the behaviors of a lot of them. And one of the things that's really interesting and important to me is understanding the spatial component, understanding the habitat requirements of a lot of these species, and also how they actually move through the landscape, which is really important for conservation because we may have two bird species that use very similar habitats, but move very differently through the landscape. So you might have one species that is very tolerant of moving across open areas to find food resources, whereas another species may have very similar habitat, but may be very shy about moving across those open areas. Maybe they're fearful of predation and stuff. So this is a really important thing to understand for conservation, is how these animals are actually moving through the landscape. Additionally, I'd like to point out, since we're in Georgia right now, that Costa Rica is critical habitat for a lot of wintering migratory bird species, as well as habitat for a whole bunch of resident species. So just kind of making that little North American connection. And then one thing that's really important to understand, we have this incredible biodiversity, but we also have a landscape that's changing very rapidly. Steve and Karen fortunately set this up really well, so I'm not going to waste too much time talking about it. But as y'all heard an hour or so ago, from the 1950s to the 1980s, Costa Rica's land cover has changed dramatically. 2/3 of its forests were cleared during that time period. However, since the early 1990s, forests have been generally recovering. But one thing that's important to note is, while there has been a general trend in increase in forest cover, it hasn't necessarily been super well planned out from a conservation perspective. There's been very little actual targeting of where to add forest, especially in terms of targeting towards what is actually beneficial for some of these species of conservation concern. So that's one of the things that we really want to tie in with my research, is actually understanding what constitutes critical habitat for some of these species and what they need for their continued success, and then being able to kind of target out some of this reforestation to make it more efficient and better suit the needs of these species that we're actually trying to protect. So just kind of general objectives for my project are to identify factors that predict the presence of different bird species, and then analyze movement patterns and habitat use, and use that data to determine how changes in landscape structure affect occupancy and movement patterns, and then use that to inform conservation planning and project the impacts of land use decision making on these bird species. And then again, this has been pretty well set up, but our study area is the Bellbird Biological Corridor in Costa Rica, and the University of Georgia's campus is up there, that orange dot. So that's kind of where we've been based right now, and we're hoping to kind of gradually expand down the corridor. But right now, all the research I'm going to talk about has been primarily in the upper portion of this corridor. So now we'll get into the methods, which is the fun part. So we get to play a lot with birds. It's pretty fun. First part of the project is to assess occupancy. So generally, we're kind of looking at which species are present where. So we set up mist nets at a whole bunch of different sites to capture a whole bunch of different landscape gradients. So trying to set up at sites maybe that have a high percentage of forest cover within a certain radius of the nets, or set up nets at higher elevation sites and then compare that with maybe lower elevation sites or sites that have a much lower percentage of forest within that radius. So we're able to capture all of these different gradients and see which birds we're catching there. So to catch the birds, what we do is we set up mist nets, which are like spider webs for birds. And so it's these real fine strands. It creates a webbing, a mesh, and we set them up against a dense forest backdrop so the birds can't really see them. They're black. We set these nets up before dawn every day so that the birds are still asleep while we do it, so we don't tip them off. And then We check the nets every hour, and we extract the birds that we've caught, and we put them in these cloth bags to take them back for processing. And when we take them back, we'll take a whole bunch of different measurements on the birds. Some examples are we'll weigh every bird, we'll identify what species it is. We will determine the sex of the bird when possible. For example, on this golden olive woodpecker, and there's a speaker. This golden olive woodpecker, we can tell this is a female because the male would have a red mustache stripe here. We'll also try to age the birds when possible. This black-faced solitaire is a good example. It has these brown speckles that you can see, and that shows that it's a juvenile bird. An adult would lose that speckling. And then we'll actually band every bird that we catch. So we put these metal numbered bands on every bird, and that allows us to identify when we recapture a bird. It's super important when we're assessing what birds are, present in different sites. We want to kind of know the abundance. So we want to know if we're catching like these long-tailed manakins here, we want to know if we caught 30 of them at one site, we want to know, are we catching the same 3 birds over and over and over again, or are there like actually 30 different individuals here? So the way we do that is we have this leg gauge, and we'll measure the birds, the diameter of the bird's leg to know which band size to put on, and then we'll put the band on. And then for some of our target species, like these motmots and toucanets, we'll actually put color bands on the legs as well, and we'll do that in a unique combination so that we can then visually identify that individual in the field. And then we look at movement. So we have these radio transmitters here, and we attach them to the birds using a backpack style harness. So each of these loops will go around one of its legs, and then the transmitter will sit on its lower back. And we selected 2 species to start with for tracking, blue-throated toucanets and blue diadem motmots. We chose these species because they're both medium-sized birds, so they were big enough that we could put a transmitter on without adversely impacting their movement patterns. And they also are both primarily frugivorous, they're both forest dependent, and they're both resident species, so they're not going to migrate. We also selected them because we hypothesized that they would have different tolerances to fragmentation. So toucanets tend to be seen a lot more flying over open pasture land to forage, whereas motmots tend to stay primarily in the forest. So we thought that they would be kind of a cool comparison. And then we track these birds using radio telemetry. So you can see here, each transmitter is set to a unique radio frequency, and then we'll use the antenna to go out and pick it up in the field and try to follow it. This is very challenging when you're in montane tropical forest because it's very steep and it's very dense, but we do the best we can. And so far through our first field season, we've caught 562 different birds, representing 84 different species, which is pretty cool. You can see a few of them here. We've set up nets at a whole bunch of different sites. This is actually just a subset of all the places that we've set up nets. And you can see this is a nice frequency distribution of the species we've caught. You can see there's a few species that we've caught a ton of and a lot of species that we've caught a few of. So highlight a few. This is a Swainsons thrush. This is a bird that we've caught the most of. We've caught 59 individuals. They are migratory, so they actually spend their summers in the United States, and then they migrate down to South America. So they actually don't even really spend any time in Costa Rica, but as they're passing through, they just fill up the nets. So it's pretty crazy. Second most common species that we've caught is the long-tailed manakin. This is a resident bird in the Costa Rican highlands. We catch a bunch of clay-colored thrushes. This is the national bird of Costa Rica. They're known for their song and not their striking, beautiful appearance. And there's a lot of other birds that we catch a lot fewer of. For example, this summer tanager. Tracking results, so far we've caught 25 motmots and we've caught 3 toucanets. So toucanets have proved a lot more difficult to catch. We've realized that we need to actually set up canopy nets to do that. And so we actually have developed this whole pulley system so that we can actually set nets up 15 or so meters into the canopy, but we haven't done it a whole lot yet, so we haven't caught a lot, but that's gonna change soon. But we have a bunch of locations for some of these birds, and that allows us to start doing some preliminary analysis. We can identify home ranges for individuals. We can then look at maybe the land cover within that home range to identify, what kind of land cover they're using. and see if that's, changing with birds in more like fragmented or more intact landscapes. And now just kind of to get into this, obviously that was all the stuff from year 1 of this study. So we have a lot more to go. So what's next? We want to increase our sample sizes and number of sites. So we're going to mistnet at a whole bunch more locations, catch a whole bunch more birds. It's going to be super cool. And we're going to increase our sample size. It's going to be great. We're going to set up canopy nets a whole lot more so that we can target particularly the toucanets, but also other species that we only find more in the mid-story or canopy of the forest because they've been underrepresented in what we're catching right now. And we also are going to start putting lightweight GPS units on the birds so that we can track them much more effectively. This will allow us to get a whole bunch more locations for each of the birds, and it'll save on a lot of frustration in trying to track them on the side of a mountain that is covered in vines. And we also are working to develop models. So for instance, with all of our occupancy stuff that we get when we catch the birds, we're working to use that to parameterize species distribution models. So what that kind of means is, for example, if we're only catching a certain species, maybe that summer tanager at this elevation band, maybe this is 1,000 to 1,100 meters, we can parameterize and say, okay, they're only found in this band, and we can then use addition to use a whole bunch of other different gradients that we're seeing, and then we can add all of those together and predict out where we would expect to find those species. And similarly, we're also developing individual-based models with the species that we're tracking, so we can actually try to understand how these birds are behaving and how they're moving through the landscape. And then using this individual-based model, we can do experiments that we could never do like in the field. So for example, we couldn't come in and like cut this whole area and see how that was going to change the bird's behavior. But if we can get our computer birds to behave like real birds, then we can actually go in the computer and we can manipulate the landscape and see how those landscape changes are going to affect bird behavior. And then we can use that to report out on how like actual real life land use decisions might impact birds. And finally, this fall, we're going to do some participatory mapping where we're going to actually meet with members of the Biological Corridor Council and have them identify places maybe that they think are priorities for conservation, or maybe they think are more important for agriculture and stuff. And we are going to collect all of that data and then compare it to our ecological data. And just to wrap up, the broader impacts of this study are it's going to provide much greater insight into the behavioral traits of a whole lot of poorly studied tropical bird species, and will predict how landscape change is going to affect those species. And then finally, this data can actually be used in real life conservation planning, which is pretty cool. So I'd like to acknowledge my advisor, Nate Nivlik, and the rest of my committee, my lab mates, and a whole bunch of people that have contributed some money to help make this study possible. And finally, I'd like to give my utmost thanks to Jessica Murray and Greg Nepps, who have been some pretty amazing field assistants. None of this would be possible without them. And I'd like to turn it over to questions, but first point out to Kristen that other people can catch bats as well.
I had some bird pictures I didn't.
So yeah.